The storm took my house, but it was him who destroyed my life. I'm standing in what used to be my living room, except there are no walls anymore. Just splintered wood, twisted metal, and the smell of wet earth mixed with something chemical I can't name. My shoes are caked in mud that isn't really mud anymore. It's everything that used to be inside my home, ground into a thick paste by the rain that hasn't stopped for 3 days. The sky is still gray, low and heavy, like it's pressing down on my chest. I can barely breathe. My hands are shaking. Not from the cold, though it is cold. That kind of damp cold that gets into your bones and stays there. No, I'm shaking because of what I'm holding. A phone. Derek's phone. The screen is cracked, smeared with rainwater, but I can still see it. I can see everything. The messages. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Months of conversations I was never supposed to see. Words that make my stomach twist so violently, I have to lean against what's left of the kitchen counter to keep from falling. Her name is Vanessa. Vanessa Chen. The woman who lived across the street. The one who always waved when I left for work in the mornings. The one who brought over lemon bars last Christmas. I scroll up. I don't want to, but I can't stop. There are photos. I recognize the couch in some of them. Our couch. The one I picked out at the thrift store in Hendersonville because it was the exact shade of blue I'd been looking for. There are messages about me. About how tired he is. How he's been pretending for so long. How he can't wait until it's over. The last message, sent 2 days ago, just hours before the storm hit, says, "When she finds out, we can finally live for real." I hear footsteps behind me, heavy boots on broken glass. I don't turn around. I already know it's him. Derek, my husband of 8 years. The man who held my hand at my father's funeral. The man who used to kiss my forehead every morning before I left for work. Who called me sunshine, even on days when I felt like anything but. He stops a few feet away. I can feel him there. His presence like a weight in the air. He doesn't say anything at first. Maybe he's waiting for me to scream, to throw something, to collapse. I don't do any of those things. I just stand there, holding his phone, staring at the place where our dining table used to be. There's a single fork lying in the rubble, bent at an odd angle. "Claire," he finally says. His voice is hoarse, like he's been crying. Maybe he has. "I'm sorry." I turn to look at him then. His face is red, streaked with dirt and tears. His hands are hanging at his sides, useless. He looks smaller than I remember, like he's shrinking right in front of me, but I don't feel sorry for him. I don't feel anything except a strange, hollow ringing in my ears like I'm underwater. "You're sorry," I repeat. My voice sounds flat, distant, like it's coming from someone else's mouth. He nods, biting his lip. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I didn't want you to find out this way." "Then how did you want me to find out?" I ask. The question surprises even me. It sounds so calm, so reasonable, like we're discussing what to have for dinner. He doesn't answer. He just looks down at the ground, at the wreckage of everything we built together. The silence stretches out between us, thick and suffocating. Somewhere in the distance, I hear a siren, an ambulance maybe, or a fire truck. There are so many emergencies right now. So many people who lost everything in the storm, but none of them lost what I lost, because the storm didn't take my husband. He was already gone. And if you believe that destiny can change in an instant, subscribe to hear this story until the end. Before the storm, before the phone, before everything shattered, my life was small and quiet, and mine. I was Claire Morrison, 3rd grade teacher at Riverside Elementary in Asheville, North Carolina. Every morning at 6:15, I woke up to the sound of Derek's alarm, the old digital one that buzzed like an angry hornet. He always hit snooze twice. I never did. I'd slip out of bed, pad across the cold hardwood floor in my bare feet, and start the coffee. Our house was a small 2-bedroom bungalow on Maple Street, painted a faded yellow that I always meant to refresh but never got around to. It had a front porch with a swing that creaked when you sat on it, and a backyard just big enough for Buster, our golden retriever mix, to chase squirrels he'd never catch. The kitchen was my favorite room. I'd painted the walls a cheerful butter yellow the summer after we moved in, and every Sunday morning I'd stand at the sink washing dishes while Derek read the news on his tablet at the table behind me. He'd tell me about construction projects, about the new development going up near the highway, about his crew and their complaints. I'd nod and hum in the right places, watching the sunlight slant through the window and catch the dust motes floating in the air. I loved my students. Loved the way their faces lit up when they finally understood a math problem. Loved the drawings they'd make for me with too many colors and not enough space. Loved the smell of crayons and glue and the slightly musty scent of old books in the classroom. I'd been teaching for 11 years. Every August I decorated my classroom with the same care some people reserved for their homes. Construction paper borders, alphabet posters, a reading corner with pillows I'd sewn myself, covered in fabric printed with stars and moons. Derek worked for Asheville Construction Solutions. He was a site supervisor, which meant he spent most of his days in a hard hat and steel-toed boots, checking measurements and yelling at subcontractors who cut corners. He'd come home smelling like sawdust and sweat, and I'd have dinner waiting. Spaghetti on Mondays, chicken and rice on Wednesdays, tacos on Fridays. We had our routines, our rhythms. The kind of life that doesn't make for interesting stories but feels safe, solid. We didn't fight much, didn't really talk much either, if I'm being honest. Somewhere along the way, we'd settled into a kind of comfortable silence. He'd watch sports on the couch after dinner. I'd grade papers at the kitchen table or read mystery novels in bed. On weekends, we'd go to the farmer's market downtown, buy tomatoes and fresh bread, sometimes stop for coffee at the place on Lexington Avenue. We'd hold hands walking back to the car, not because we were wildly in love anymore, but because it was what married people did. It was expected, familiar. I thought that was enough. I thought stability was the same thing as happiness. I thought the absence of conflict meant everything was fine. Looking back now, I can see how wrong I was. But back then, in those last few weeks before the storm, I was content, maybe even happy in a muted background kind of way, like elevator music. Pleasant enough that you don't really notice it's there. The last normal day I remember was a Thursday in early September. I came home from school with a headache and found Derek already there, which was unusual. He was sitting on the porch swing, still in his work clothes, staring at his phone. He looked up when I pulled into the driveway, and for just a second, I saw something in his face, something I couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or fear. But then he smiled, that easy smile I'd known for nearly a decade, and waved. "Hey, sunshine," he called out. "Rough day?" I nodded, climbing the porch steps. The Carter twins were a nightmare. I think I said the word inside voices about 40 times. He laughed, put his arm around me as I sat down next to him. The swing creaked beneath our weight. Buster came bounding around the side of the house, tail wagging, and collapsed at our feet with a satisfied groan. Everything felt normal. Everything felt fine. I had no idea I was living in the last moments of a life that was already over. The warning started on a Monday. Tropical Storm Helene had strengthened faster than anyone predicted, and by Tuesday morning, every news channel was showing the same spiraling mass of clouds moving up from the Gulf. They said it would hit the mountains by Thursday night. They said we should prepare for flooding, for power outages, for downed trees. They used words like catastrophic and unprecedented with that practiced urgency that news anchors have, the kind that makes you pay attention but not quite believe it could happen to you. Derek said he'd handle everything. He boarded up the windows on Wednesday afternoon, moving with that efficient confidence he always had when there was physical work to be done. I packed a bag with our important documents, some clothes, photo albums, Buster's medication. My sister Amanda lived in Fletcher, just 20 minutes away but on higher ground, in a newer neighborhood that the news said would be safer. She insisted we come stay with her. Derek said he'd join us after he secured the house, after he checked on the job sites, after he made sure his crew had evacuated properly. I left Thursday at noon. The sky was already strange, a yellowish gray that made everything look sick and faded. The wind was picking up, sending leaves and small branches skittering across the road. Buster sat in the passenger seat, panting nervously. His warm weight pressed against my leg every time I stopped at a light. I kept looking in the rearview mirror at our house getting smaller and smaller, that yellow bungalow that suddenly looked so fragile, so small against the darkening sky. Derek texted me at 3 o'clock. "All set here. Heading to check the Riverside site, then I'll come your way. Love you." I texted back a heart emoji. It was the last normal exchange we ever had. The storm hit around 7 that evening. Amanda's house shook with every gust of wind. We sat in her living room with candles and flashlights, listening to the radio, to the reports of flooding downtown, of landslides in the mountains, of whole neighborhoods disappearing under muddy water. The power went out at 8. We didn't get it back for 2 days. Derek didn't come that night. He texted around 9 saying the roads were too dangerous. He was sheltering at a coworker's apartment closer to downtown. I told him to stay safe. I told him I loved him. He sent back a thumbs up. Just a thumbs up. At the time, I thought nothing of it. He was probably stressed, exhausted, dealing with emergencies. Now I know he was with her, with Vanessa, in her apartment on the east side, the one that didn't flood, the one where they'd been meeting for months. I couldn't go home until Saturday. The roads were blocked, the National Guard was everywhere, and the news kept showing aerial footage of neighborhoods I recognized, now transformed into lakes of brown water filled with floating debris. When they finally cleared Maple Street, Amanda drove me. I made her wait in the car while I walked up alone. I didn't want her to see my face when I saw what was left. There was no house anymore. Not really. The roof had collapsed entirely on the left side. The front porch where Derek and I had sat just days before was gone, ripped away like paper. Water had surged through, carrying away furniture, appliances, parts of walls. Everything was coated in thick mud that smelled like sewage and rot, and something else. Something chemical and wrong. Our yellow kitchen was a hollow shell. The bedroom where I'd slept for 8 years was open to the sky. I stood there in my rain boots, Amanda's borrowed coat too big on my shoulders, and I couldn't cry. Couldn't feel anything except a strange numbness, like I was watching this happen to someone else. I started picking through the rubble, not really looking for anything, just moving pieces of my life around. A broken plate, a soggy textbook, one of my teaching posters, the one with the alphabet animals torn and muddy. That's when I saw his truck, Derek's truck, parked at an angle in the driveway, covered in mud and leaves. He'd said he was coming from the Riverside site, but his truck was here, which meant he'd been here, recently. I walked over, my boots squelching in the saturated ground, and tried the door. Unlocked. The interior was surprisingly dry. He must have closed the windows before the worst of it hit. There were fast food wrappers on the passenger seat, a work jacket, his hard hat, and on the center console, face down, his phone, his backup phone, the older iPhone he used for work calls. He always carried 2. I picked it up. The screen was cracked, but it turned on. He hadn't logged out of anything. I stood there in the ruins of my home, holding my husband's phone, and I started reading. Messages. Hundreds of them. Going back 6 months. 7. Photos. Plans. Complaints about me. About how boring I was. How predictable. How he felt trapped. And her responses. Always encouraging. Always understanding. Always waiting. The most recent message was from Thursday, sent at 6:47 p.m., right when the storm was starting. Be safe, baby. When this is over, everything changes. When she finds out, we can finally live for real. That's when Derek appeared, walking up the driveway like a ghost, his face pale and drawn. He stopped when he saw me holding the phone. We just looked at each other across the wreckage, across the gap that had always been there, but I'd been too comfortable to see. He tried to explain. Standing there in the ruins of our home, with mud up to our ankles and the smell of destruction everywhere, Claire Morrison tried to explain why he'd been sleeping with our neighbor for 7 months. His voice kept cracking. He kept running his hands through his hair, that gesture he always did when he was stressed, and I watched him like I was watching a stranger. Maybe I was. He said he didn't mean for it to happen. Said it started innocently. Vanessa had asked him to look at a leaking faucet in her kitchen back in March. He went over one Saturday morning while I was at a teacher development workshop. One thing led to another. He used that exact phrase. One thing led to another. Like he was describing how he ended up buying the wrong brand of coffee, not how he ended up betraying 8 years of marriage. He said he still cared about me, that I was a good person, a good wife, that this wasn't about me at all. It was about him. He'd been feeling lost, feeling like his life was on autopilot, like he was just going through motions. Vanessa made him feel alive again, made him feel seen. She was spontaneous, adventurous, everything he'd been missing. She worked from home as a graphic designer, had flexible hours, was always available when he needed to talk. Not like me, he didn't say, but I heard it anyway. Always at school or grading papers or too tired to do anything but exist. I didn't yell, didn't scream. I just stood there holding his phone, watching his mouth move, hearing words that sounded like they were coming from underwater. Behind him, I could see what was left of our bedroom through the collapsed wall. Our bed was on its side, the mattress soaked and ruined. I thought about all the nights we'd slept there, backs to each other, the gap between us growing wider with each passing year. Had I known? Had some part of me always known? He said he was going to tell me, said he'd been planning to, but then the storm came and everything got complicated. He said it like the storm was the problem, like the weather was what ruined us, not his hands on another woman's body, not his lies, not 7 months of coming home to me after being with her. I asked him one question, just one. My voice sounded hollow, scraped clean of everything. Do you love her? He didn't answer right away. That pause, that moment of hesitation told me everything. When he finally said yes, so quiet I almost didn't hear it, something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a clean break, like a bone fracturing under pressure it was never meant to bear. I handed him his phone, turned and walked back to Amanda's car. He called after me, said we needed to talk more, needed to figure things out, needed to make plans. I kept walking. Buster was waiting in the back seat, his tail wagging when he saw me. At least someone was happy to see me. At least someone's love was uncomplicated. The church offered me a trailer. Riverside Community Church, the one I'd attended sporadically over the years, had set up a temporary housing program for storm victims. The trailer was a 30-foot RV parked in their overflow lot, donated by a family from Tennessee. It smelled like mildew and pine cleaner. The twang pulled out from the wall. There was a tiny bathroom, a kitchenette with 2 burners, a table that folded down. Everything was beige or brown or some sad combination of both. I moved in on Sunday. Amanda tried to convince me to stay with her longer, but I couldn't. Couldn't stand her husband's pitying looks. Couldn't stand the way she kept saying everything would be okay when we both knew it wouldn't. I needed to be alone. Needed to sit with what had happened. Let it sink in like water into wood. The first night I couldn't sleep. I lay on that thin mattress, listening to the metal walls tick and settle around me, and I tried to remember the last time Derek had really looked at me, really seen me. Not just glanced in my direction or nodded at something I'd said, but looked at me the way you look at someone you love. I couldn't remember. Maybe it had been years. Maybe it had never happened at all. I stopped eating. Amanda brought food. Neighbors from church brought casseroles, but everything tasted like cardboard. I'd take a few bites to be polite, then scrape the rest into the trash when they left. I lost 12 pounds in 3 weeks. My clothes hung off me. I didn't care. I requested a leave of absence from school, told the principal I needed time to deal with the storm damage, with the insurance, with getting my life back together. She was understanding, told me to take all the time I needed. My classroom sat empty. Someone else taught my students. I'd spent 11 years building that career, that identity, and I walked away from it without looking back because I couldn't imagine standing in front of those children and pretending to be whole. At night, I'd sit at the folding table with my wedding ring in front of me, turning it over and over in my fingers. It was a simple gold band, nothing fancy, bought at a jewelry store in the mall because we couldn't afford anything elaborate. I'd worn it every day for 8 years. Now it felt like a lie made of metal, something that promised permanence but delivered nothing but empty weight. Buster was the only reason I got out of bed. He needed walks, needed food, needed me to exist even when I didn't want to. So I existed, barely, going through motions that felt mechanical and distant, like I was operating my own body from somewhere far away. 3 weeks after I moved into the trailer, Amanda convinced me to go to the Red Cross donation center downtown. She said I needed basic things, kitchen supplies, towels, maybe some clothes that actually fit since everything I owned had either been destroyed or was now 2 sizes too big. I didn't want to go. The thought of standing in line with other storm victims, sorting through donated items while volunteers smiled at me with practiced sympathy, made my skin crawl. But Amanda was insistent, and I'd learned that sometimes it was easier to just agree than to fight. The donation center was set up in the old National Guard Armory on Haywood Street, a cavernous space that echoed with voices and the scraping of boxes across concrete. Folding tables stretched in long rows, piled high with clothes organized by rough categories. Women's shirts, men's pants, children's everything. The air smelled like detergent and cardboard, and that particular scent of used things. Items that had lived other lives in other homes before ending up here. I walked slowly down the aisles, Buster's leash wrapped around my wrist, because they'd allowed people to bring their pets. He stayed close to my leg, sensing my mood the way dogs do. I picked up a blue sweater, put it back down, grabbed a set of mixing bowls still in their packaging. Someone's unopened wedding gift, probably. Everything felt surreal, like I was shopping for someone else's life. That's when I tripped. My foot caught on the edge of a cardboard box someone had left in the aisle, and I felt myself falling forward, arms windmilling uselessly. The mixing bowls flew out of my hands. I had just enough time to think about how much it was going to hurt when I hit the concrete floor, and then someone caught me. Strong hands gripped my shoulders, steadying me before I could fall. I looked up into a face I almost recognized. A man, probably early 30s, with brown hair that needed cutting, and a thin scar running through his left eyebrow. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and covered in sawdust. His hands were calloused and rough, the hands of someone who worked with them every day. "Whoa, careful there," he said, his voice low and warm. "You okay?" I nodded, stepping back quickly, embarrassed. "I'm fine. Thank you." I wasn't watching where I was going. He bent down and picked up the mixing bowls, checking them for damage before handing them back to me. That's when I really looked at him, and something clicked in my memory. "Ethan?" I said, uncertain. He looked at me more carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to place me. Then recognition dawned. "Mrs. Morrison? From Riverside Elementary? Claire?" I corrected automatically. "Just Claire." The Mrs. Morrison felt like a name that belonged to someone else now, someone who'd existed in a different lifetime. Ethan Calloway. I remembered now. He was the older brother of Tommy Calloway, one of my students from 5 or 6 years ago, a sweet kid who'd struggled with reading until something finally clicked in February of 3rd grade. Ethan had come to parent-teacher conferences a few times because their mother worked nights and couldn't make it. He'd been young then, maybe 24 or 25, working construction and raising his little brother after their dad had left. I remembered thinking he'd seemed exhausted but determined, asking careful questions about how he could help Tommy at home. "I heard about the storm damage in your area," he said, his expression shifting to something gentler. "I'm sorry. That's rough." I shrugged, that automatic gesture people make when they don't want to talk about things that hurt. "A lot of people lost a lot more. That doesn't make your loss less real," he said, and something about the way he said it, without pity but with understanding, made my throat tighten. An awkward silence stretched between us. I could hear volunteers calling out to each other across the warehouse, someone's child crying in the distance. Ethan shifted his weight, glancing at the boxes stacked against the wall behind him. "I'm actually here volunteering," he said. "Came down from Knoxville with a crew to help with rebuilding. We're staying at the church on Merriman, working on houses in the affected areas." "That's kind of you," I managed. "It's what people do," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "You need help finding anything specific? I know this place is kind of a maze." I wanted to say no, wanted to finish my shopping alone, retreat back to my trailer, back to my isolation, but something in his face stopped me. Maybe it was the scar through his eyebrow, the visual proof that he'd been through his own hard times. Maybe it was just the bone-deep exhaustion of being alone with my grief for 3 weeks. Whatever it was, I found myself nodding. "Kitchen stuff, mostly," I said. "I'm living in a trailer in the church lot. Don't have much." "I know that lot," he said. "I've been working on a house 2 streets over." He started walking toward a section with household goods, and I followed, Buster trotting between us. Ethan moved with purpose, scanning the tables efficiently, pulling items and stacking them in my arms. Dish towels, a can opener, a decent knife that someone had donated. He didn't ask intrusive questions, didn't push for my story. He just helped, his movements practical and kind. When my arms were full, he grabbed an empty box and started loading things into it. "This should get you started," he said. "If you need furniture or bigger items, There's another distribution center over on Riverside Drive. Thank you, I said, and meant it. Really. He smiled, and it transformed his whole face. Made him look younger despite the tired lines around his eyes. No problem. Take care of yourself, Claire. I watched him walk back toward the volunteer staging area, his flannel shirt disappearing into the crowd of people sorting donations. Buster whined softly and looked up at me. For the first time in 3 weeks, I felt something other than numbness. Just a flicker, barely there, but real. Something that felt almost like relief, like a tiny crack in the wall I'd built around myself where light could get in. Ethan Calloway started showing up. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way that felt intrusive or demanding. But he was suddenly there. A presence at the edges of my collapsing life. The first time was 2 days after the donation center. I came back to the trailer around 4 in the afternoon, exhausted from a pointless meeting with an insurance adjuster, who'd explained in clinical detail why most of my claim would be denied, and found a stack of plywood leaning against the side of the trailer. Not new wood, but good quality, sanded smooth, cut to size. There was no note, but I knew. The church volunteers would have said something if they'd delivered it. This was quiet, anonymous, the kind of help that didn't expect acknowledgement. I ran my hand over the wood, feeling the smooth surface, and felt that flicker again, that tiny warmth I'd felt at the donation center. The trailer's door had been damaged, hanging crooked on its hinges and letting in cold air at night. I'd been meaning to ask someone from the church to look at it, but I kept forgetting, or maybe I just didn't care enough to remember. That evening, I used the plywood to create a temporary seal, wedging it into place. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. The trailer felt a degree warmer that night. 3 days later, I found a container on the metal steps leading up to the door. Tupperware, the good kind with the snap-lock lid, still warm. I opened it carefully. Beef stew, thick with vegetables, the kind that's been simmering for hours. There was a piece of masking tape on top with 2 words written in neat block letters. Volunteer lunch leftovers. I sat at my tiny folding table and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. It was the first meal in weeks that I actually tasted, that registered as something other than obligation. The meat was tender, falling apart under my fork. The carrots were sweet. There was rosemary in it, and thyme, herbs that reminded me of cooking in my yellow kitchen, of the life I used to have. When I finished, I washed the container carefully, dried it, and set it by the door to return. But the next morning it was gone, replaced by another container. Chicken and rice this time. This pattern continued. Every few days, food would appear. Sometimes in the morning before I left for my daily walk with Buster. Sometimes in the evening. Always in that same handwriting. Leftovers. After the 3rd container, I stopped believing they were really leftovers from volunteer meals. This was someone cooking for me. Someone who'd noticed I wasn't eating. Who cared enough to do something about it without making me feel like a charity case. I knew it was Ethan. Of course I knew. But I didn't say anything. Didn't acknowledge it. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting I needed help. Would mean letting someone in. And I wasn't ready for that. Wasn't ready to trust again. To believe that someone could do kind things without wanting something in return. Then one Thursday afternoon, I ran into him at the hardware store on Patton Avenue. I was looking for weather stripping. Something to seal the windows better now that October had arrived, and the nights were getting cold. He was in the lumber section, checking measurements on a piece of trim, and our eyes met across the aisle. "Hey," he said, walking over. He was wearing work clothes, jeans covered in drywall dust, and a thermal shirt with paint stains. "How's the trailer treating you?" "Better since someone mysteriously fixed my door situation," I said, watching his face. He didn't even try to deny it. Just shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Saw it was giving you trouble. Had some spare wood lying around." "And spare food?" I asked. "They feed us pretty well at the volunteer kitchen," he said. That same easy tone. Hate to see good food go to waste. We both knew he was lying. We both knew I knew he was lying. But there was something gentle in the lie. Something that let me accept his help without feeling diminished by it. I looked down at Buster, who'd planted himself at Ethan's feet and was wagging his tail hopefully. "Traitor," I muttered at the dog. Ethan laughed and bent down to scratch behind Buster's ears. "He's a good boy. What's his name?" "Buster." "Hey, Buster." You taking care of your mom? The word mom shouldn't have hit me the way it did, but suddenly my eyes were burning and I had to look away, pretending to examine a display of sandpaper. I hadn't cried since the day I found Derek's phone. Hadn't let myself, but something about this moment, about this relative stranger being kind to my dog, using that word mom like I was someone worth caring for, broke something loose inside me. Claire? Ethan's voice was gentle. You okay? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Kept staring at the sandpaper like it was the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen. Coarse grit, medium grit, fine grit. Listen, he said quietly. I'm not trying to intrude. I know what it's like, when everything falls apart, when you're just trying to survive one day at a time. Sometimes it helps to know someone's paying attention, that you're not completely alone. I finally looked at him. His brown eyes were steady, kind, without pity. There was understanding there, the kind that comes from experience, from having been in dark places yourself. Thank you, I managed, for the food, for the wood, for everything. You don't have to thank me, he said. Just, if you need anything, I'm around. Working mostly on Montfort Avenue, the blue house with the collapsed garage, but I'm at the church most evenings. He gave Buster one more pat and walked away, leaving me standing there in the hardware store with weather stripping in my hands, and tears finally starting to slip down my cheeks. I started seeing Ethan more regularly after that day in the hardware store, though I told myself it was coincidence. He'd be working on the blue house when I walked Buster past in the mornings. I'd run into him at the grocery store on Saturday afternoons. He'd wave from across the church parking lot when I was taking out trash from the trailer. Each encounter was brief, casual, nothing that demanded anything from me, but they accumulated, these small moments, building into something I couldn't quite name and wasn't sure I wanted to. By mid-October, we'd fallen into an unspoken routine. He'd stop by the trailer some evenings after his work crew had left, always with an excuse. Needed to borrow a screwdriver. Wanted to check if the door repair was holding up. Had extra coffee from the volunteer kitchen. We'd end up sitting on the metal steps, him on the bottom one and me on the top, Buster sprawled between us, and we'd talk. Not about anything heavy at first, just surface things. The weather. The progress on various rebuilding projects. Stories about his construction crew, a group of guys from Knoxville who apparently had opinions about everything from the best brand of power tools to whether hot dogs were sandwiches. He made me laugh. I'd forgotten what that felt like, that loosening in your chest when something is genuinely funny, when you're not performing joy but actually feeling it. He told me about Tommy, his younger brother, who was now studying engineering at NC State, about how proud he was, how he'd worked double shifts for years to help pay for it, about their mother, who'd passed away 2 years ago from breast cancer, and how he still sometimes reached for his phone to call her before remembering she was gone. That's the worst part, he said one evening, his voice quiet in the growing dark. Not the big moments of missing someone. It's the small ones. When something funny happens and you want to tell them. When you see something they would have liked. Your hand just automatically goes to call them and then you remember. I understood exactly what he meant. I kept forgetting Derek and I weren't married anymore. Would see something at the store and think, Derek likes that brand, before remembering he was living with Vanessa now, in her apartment, probably shopping at different stores, living a completely different life that didn't include me. How long does that last? I asked. The forgetting? Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark parking lot. I don't know. With my mom, it's been 2 years and I still do it sometimes, but it gets less. The space between remembering and forgetting gets longer. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The nights were cold now. Real cold. The kind that warned winter was coming. I don't know how to do this, I said, and I wasn't entirely sure what this meant. Move forward. Start over. Trust again. All of it. Nobody does, Ethan said. You just wake up and do the next thing, and then the next thing. Eventually enough, next things add up to a day, then a week. Then you realize you made it through and you're still here. Something in his words, or maybe in the gentle way he said them, cracked something open inside me. I found myself talking, really talking, for the first time since everything had fallen apart. I told him about Derek, about finding the messages, About standing in the ruins of my house and realizing my marriage had been a ruin long before the storm ever hit. About feeling stupid for not seeing it, for being so comfortable in my small, predictable life that I'd missed all the signs. Ethan listened without interrupting, without offering those useless platitudes people usually give. When I finally went quiet, wrung out from saying it all out loud, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not stupid. You trusted someone you'd made promises with. That's not stupid. That's just what you're supposed to do when you love someone." "But I should have known," I said, my voice breaking. "There must have been signs. Things I missed because I wasn't paying attention." "Maybe," he said carefully. "Or maybe he was good at hiding it. Maybe he wanted to have both things, the stability of you and the excitement of her, and he convinced himself he could. That's on him, Claire, not you." I wanted to believe him, wanted to stop carrying this weight of failure, this sense that I'd somehow caused my own destruction by being boring, predictable, too comfortable. But belief felt dangerous. Belief meant opening up again. And I'd already learned what happened when you left yourself exposed. The next week, Ethan asked if I wanted help going through the remains of my house. The insurance company needed detailed documentation of what had been lost, and I'd been avoiding it. Couldn't face walking through those ruins again. But he offered to come with me, to help catalog and photograph, to be there so I wouldn't have to do it alone. We spent a cold Saturday in November picking through debris. He was patient, methodical, holding items up for me to identify while I took photos and made notes. We found things I'd thought were lost forever. My grandmother's recipe box, water damaged but intact. A photo album from my college years. One of Derek's sweatshirts, still smelling like him despite everything. I held that sweatshirt in my hands, and something in me broke. All the tears I'd been holding back, all the grief and rage and confusion, came pouring out. I stood there in the ruins of my bedroom, clutching my cheating husband's sweatshirt, and sobbed like a child. Ethan didn't try to fix it, didn't tell me it would be okay or that I should let it go. He just stood there, solid and present, and when I finally looked up at him through my tears, he held out his hand. Not to hold mine, not to pull me close, just offering connection if I wanted it. I took his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and steady. We stood there like that, in the wreckage, not moving, just holding on while the November wind rattled through the broken walls. That night, back at the trailer, I realized something that terrified me. I was starting to feel something for Ethan Calloway, something more than gratitude, more than friendship. Something that felt like hope, like possibility, like maybe I could be something other than broken, and that terrified me more than anything else had. I pulled away after that day in the ruins. Not dramatically, not with explanations or confrontations, but with the quiet retreat of someone who'd touched something hot and learned to keep their distance. When Ethan stopped by the trailer, I'd claim exhaustion. When I saw him in the church parking lot, I'd wave but keep walking. I stopped sitting on the steps with him in the evenings, stopped accepting the food that still appeared at my door, though he kept leaving it anyway. I told myself I was protecting myself. Told myself it was too soon, that I was too damaged, that getting close to anyone right now would be a mistake. But the truth I could barely admit even to myself, was that I was afraid of being wrong again, afraid of trusting my judgment when my judgment had already failed me so completely. Afraid that if I let myself care about Ethan, I'd discover he was just another Derek, another person who'd eventually decide I wasn't enough. 2 weeks passed like this, 2 weeks of hollow days where I went through motions and felt myself sliding back into that numb place I'd lived in right after the betrayal. Amanda noticed. She came by the trailer one afternoon and found me sitting at the table, staring at nothing, and she actually got angry. "What are you doing?" she demanded, standing in the doorway with her hands on her hips like she was scolding one of her kids. "You were getting better. You were eating again. You were going outside. Now look at you." "I'm fine," I said automatically. "You're not fine, and I think I know why." She sat down across from me, her expression softening. "It's that guy, isn't it? The one who's been helping you." I didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Claire," she said gently, "not everyone is Derek." "I know that," I said, but I didn't. Not really. In my head, every man was potentially Derek. Every kindness was potentially manipulation. Every smile was potentially hiding betrayal. The next morning, Buster got out. I'd left the trailer door open for just a minute while carrying in groceries, and he bolted, chasing a squirrel across the parking lot and into the street. I ran after him, screaming his name, heart pounding with the kind of panic that comes from the thought of losing one more thing. He disappeared around a corner, heading toward downtown, toward traffic and busy intersections and all the ways a dog could get hurt. I found him 20 minutes later at the construction site on Montfort Avenue, the blue house with the collapsed garage. He was lying in the dirt, panting happily, while Ethan scratched behind his ears. When Ethan saw me running up, breathless and terrified, he stood quickly. "He's okay," he said immediately. "He just ran up about 5 minutes ago. I was about to call you, but I don't have your number." I collapsed onto the ground next to Buster, my legs giving out from relief and exhaustion. "You scared me," I told the dog, burying my face in his fur. He licked my cheek, completely unconcerned about the terror he'd caused. Ethan crouched down next to us. "You okay?" I wasn't. I was shaking, tears streaming down my face, and it wasn't just about the dog. It was everything. The accumulated weight of loss and fear and loneliness, all of it hitting me at once. "I can't lose him too," I whispered. "I can't. He's all I have left." "Hey," Ethan said softly. "You didn't lose him. He's right here. He's fine." But I couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop the words that came pouring out. "I'm sorry I've been avoiding you. I'm sorry I'm such a mess. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to trust anyone anymore. I don't know how to tell the difference between someone who's actually kind and someone who's just pretending until they get bored. And I'm so tired of being afraid all the time, but I don't know how to stop." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down fully in the dirt next to me, his back against the foundation of the house he was rebuilding. "Claire," he said, his voice steady and sure, "you don't have to trust me. You don't have to do anything, but I need you to know something." He paused, making sure I was listening. "You're not broken. You're rebuilding, and that's the bravest thing anyone can do." I looked at him then, really looked at him, at the sawdust in his hair, at the kindness in his eyes, at the way he sat there in the dirt with me, not rushing, not demanding, just present. And I realized something that shifted everything. He had never asked me for anything. Not once. Not my time, not my attention, not my gratitude. He'd just shown up, day after day, and helped, without expectation, without agenda. He'd fed me when I couldn't feed myself, fixed things without being asked, listened without judging, and when I'd pulled away, he'd respected that too. Hadn't pushed, hadn't demanded explanations, just kept being there, steady and constant, like a lighthouse in the storm. This man, this near stranger, had been taking care of me for months, not because he wanted something from me, but because he saw someone who needed help and decided to be the kind of person who helped. That was who he was. Not performing kindness, but living it. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why do you keep showing up? Why do you care?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I've been where you are. After my mom died, after years of just surviving and taking care of Tommy and never dealing with my own stuff, I fell apart, couldn't work, couldn't function. And people showed up for me. Neighbors, co-workers, people I barely knew. They just kept showing up until I could stand on my own again." He looked at me, and there was something raw in his expression. "So now I show up, for other people, because I know what it means. Because I know what it's like to need someone and have them actually be there." Something in my chest loosened. Not all the way, not completely, but enough that I could breathe a little easier, enough that I could imagine, maybe, possibly, learning to trust again, learning that not everyone leaves, that some people stay. The house took 6 months to build. Not my old house. That yellow bungalow on Maple Street was gone forever, bulldozed and cleared after the insurance finally came through with a partial settlement. This was something new, something mine. A small cottage on the outskirts of Asheville, near the Swannanoa River, on a 1/4-acre lot that the church helped me purchase through their disaster relief fund. It was modest, just 2 bedrooms and a single bathroom, but it had good bones and a view of the mountains that took my breath away every morning. Ethan drew up the plans. We sat at his kitchen table one Sunday afternoon in January, Buster asleep at our feet, while he sketched on graph paper and asked me questions. What did I need? What did I want? Where did the light come in? He listened to every answer, made notes in the margins, erased and redrew until the lines on the page started to look like a home. Not the home I'd lost, but something better, something intentional, something that was mine from the foundation up. The build began in February. Ethan's crew from Knoxville had gone back home after Christmas. Their volunteer stint complete, but he'd stayed. Said there was more work here, more people who needed help. And he'd always liked Asheville anyway. I suspected I was part of the reason he stayed, though neither of us said it out loud. We'd been circling around something for months, this growing thing between us that neither of us quite knew how to name. I helped with the construction when I could. I'd gone back to teaching in January, returning to my third graders who'd made welcome back cards with crooked letters and too much glitter. It felt good to be back in the classroom, to have purpose again, to remember who I was beyond the woman whose husband had cheated and whose house had been destroyed. But after school and on weekends, I'd drive out to the building site and work alongside Ethan and the local contractors he'd hired. I learned how to properly swing a hammer, how to read a level, how to apply joint compound to drywall seams. My hands developed new calluses. My arms got stronger. There was something deeply satisfying about building something with your own hands, about seeing walls go up and knowing you'd helped raise them. Every nail I drove felt like an act of reclamation, like I was building more than just a house. I was building a new version of myself. Ethan was patient with my mistakes, encouraging with my small victories. When I finally managed to cut a board in a straight line with the circular saw, he grinned like I'd won an Olympic medal. "Look at you," he said. "Carpenter Claire." The nickname stuck. The other workers started calling me that, and I wore it like a badge of honor. We fell into rhythms. He'd bring coffee in the mornings, strong and black the way I'd learned to like it. We'd work through the day, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence with just the sound of tools and birdsong. In the evenings, we'd sit on the unfinished porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, and talk about everything and nothing. He told me about the houses he'd built, the places he'd lived, his dreams of maybe starting his own contracting business someday. I told him about my students, about the books I was reading, about how strange it felt to be starting over at 34. One evening in early April, with the framing complete and the roof going on, I asked him the question I'd been holding for weeks. Why did you really stay in Asheville? He was quiet for a moment, his hands wrapped around a bottle of water, his eyes on the darkening sky. "You know why," he said finally. My heart stuttered in my chest. "Tell me anyway." He turned to look at me then, and there was something raw and honest in his face. "Because of you. Because I wanted to see you build this. Because being around you makes me remember what it feels like to want something for myself, not just for other people. Because," he trailed off, shaking his head, "because I'm falling in love with you, Claire. Have been for months. And I know the timing is terrible. I know you're still healing. I don't expect anything. I needed you to know. I should have been scared, should have felt that familiar panic, that urge to run. But sitting there on my unfinished porch, the smell of fresh lumber all around us, and the sound of the river in the distance, all I felt was certainty. This man, who'd shown up when I had nothing and asked for nothing in return, who'd fed me and fixed my door and brought my dog back and helped me build a house with his own hands, who'd been patient with my fear and gentle with my grief and constant through all of it. This man was real. This love was real. "I'm falling in love with you too," I said, and watched his face transform with something like wonder. He didn't kiss me then, though I could see he wanted to. Instead, he reached out and took my hand, threading his calloused fingers through mine, and we sat there as the last light faded from the sky and the stars started to appear. It felt like a beginning, not the explosive, passionate beginning of young love, but something steadier, something built on foundation and framework, on truth and time, something that could weather storms. The house was finished in late May. I moved in on a Saturday, with help from Amanda and her family, from people from church, from Ethan's contractor friends. We carried boxes and furniture, hung curtains, assembled my bed. When everyone finally left and I was alone in my new house for the first time, I walked through the empty rooms and felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of possibility. Ethan came by the next morning with coffee and donuts, a housewarming gift of caffeine and sugar. We sat on the porch, the real porch now, complete with rocking chairs he'd built himself, and watched Buster chase rabbits in the tall grass. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that makes you believe the world is good. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing at the house behind us. Did we do okay? I looked at the cottage, at its clean lines and sturdy construction, at the way the morning light hit the windows and made them glow. I thought about everything it represented. Survival, rebuilding, hope. "We did better than okay," I said. "We did perfect. It's been 3 years since the storm. 3 years since I stood in the ruins of my old life and found a phone full of betrayals. 3 years since I lost everything and, in losing it, found something better." I'm sitting on my porch now, the same porch where Ethan first told me he loved me, and I'm trying to find the words to explain what I've learned. Not for me, I already know, but for anyone out there who's standing where I stood, in the wreckage, wondering how they'll survive. The storm took my house. That's true. The wood and nails and walls that I'd thought defined my life, they're gone, scattered across North Carolina, broken down into debris, recycled into something else. But Derek took something different. He took my trust, my sense of safety, my belief that if you did everything right, if you were a good wife and a good person, and you played by all the rules, you'd be protected from pain. I'm grateful he took that. I know that sounds strange, maybe even sick, but that false sense of security was keeping me small, keeping me in a life that looked fine from the outside, but was hollow at the core. We weren't happy, Derek and I. We were comfortable. And I'd confused comfort with love, routine with intimacy, the absence of conflict with the presence of connection. The storm didn't destroy my marriage. It just revealed what was already true. Ethan didn't save me. I need to be clear about that. He didn't ride in like some knight in flannel armor and fix my broken life. I saved myself. I got up every morning in that trailer even when I wanted to stay in bed forever. I went back to teaching even when facing my students felt impossible. I made the decision to build again, to try again, to risk again. Those were my choices, my victories. But Ethan showed me what real love looks like. Not the rom-com version, not the passionate whirlwind that burns bright and fast. Real love is someone bringing you food when you can't feed yourself. It's fixing your door without being asked. It's sitting in the dirt with you while you cry about your dog. It's showing up every single day and not asking for anything in return. It's patience and presence, and the quiet determination to be there, even when there is boring and hard and unrewarding. Real love is building a house together, literally building it, board by board, nail by nail, until you've created something that didn't exist before, something solid that can weather storms because you built it to last. We got married last fall. Nothing fancy, just a simple ceremony at the Botanical Gardens with 20 people who mattered. I wore a blue dress, not white, because I'm not the same woman who got married in white all those years ago. That woman doesn't exist anymore. I'm someone different now, someone stronger, someone who knows the difference between settling and choosing, between comfort and joy, between someone who wants to own you and someone who wants to see you free. Tommy was Ethan's best man. He pulled me aside after the ceremony, this kid I'd taught to read back when he was 8 years old, now a young man studying engineering. "Thank you for not giving up on life," he said. "My brother was lost before he met you. Now he's home." But here's what I told Tommy, what I need you to hear if you're listening to this story and seeing yourself in it. Ethan wasn't lost. I wasn't lost. We were both exactly where we needed to be to become who we're meant to be. Sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what actually matters. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the universe saying, "You deserve better than this. Let me clear the way." The storm took my house, but it gave me clarity. Derek's betrayal broke my heart, but it freed me from a life that was never going to make me happy. And in the ruins of everything I'd built, I found something real. Someone real. A love that was built on truth instead of habit, on choice instead of obligation, on the daily decision to show up and be present and do the work. If you're standing in the ruins right now, if you've just discovered your own phone full of betrayals, or faced your own storm that destroyed everything you thought was solid, I want you to know something. You're going to survive this. More than survive. You're going to build something better. It won't happen overnight. It won't be easy. But brick by brick, day by day, you'll create a life that's actually yours, a life that's true. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll find someone who wants to help you build it. Not someone who wants to build it for you or tell you how it should look, but someone who hands you the hammer and asks, "Where should we start?" Someone whose love is quiet and constant and real. Someone who sees you at your worst and decides to stay anyway. That's what I found. That's what the storm gave me when it took everything else away. And if this story touched your heart, if you see yourself in these words, subscribe to this channel, because every week I share stories of women who discovered that endings are just beginnings in disguise. Women who lost everything and found that everything was never what they needed in the first place. Women who learned that the truest love arrives not in the whirlwind, but in the quiet moments of rebuilding. In the steady hands that help you stand. In the patience that waits while you heal. In the promise that some people, the right people, don't leave when things get hard. They pick up a hammer and ask, "What are we building today?"